Hey, everybody, welcome back to Engaging the Phenomenon. And today we have an ultra special guest, and that is my friend Ryan Robbins. Welcome, Ryan.
It's good to be here, James. Glad to be here.
Yeah, and I think this is actually the first time that you're on the channel solo with just me and you, because you've been here a few times for panels.
Yeah, that's accurate.
Yeah, so I'm gonna guess that everybody watching this has already seen the oversight committee hearing, which was yesterday, which is going to be July 26, 2023 for people tuning in later. I'm going to keep a link in the description for that. So if people want to watch the UAP hearing that occurred yesterday with Ryan Graves, David Fravor, and David Grush, you'll be able to see that. It's 2.5 hours long. It's a historic event. Everybody needs to watch it. No matter what you think about the subject. But, speaking to that, Ryan, I know we've both kind of been waiting for something that big to occur. What are some of your initial thoughts on the hearing occurring at all, and then the contents of it as well?
Well, the hearing occurring at all just goes to show that the trajectory from October 11th, 2017, when we had the press conference by To the Stars Academy, escalating into the release of the New York Times article on December 16th, 2017. This is kind of like the modern day ufology, if you will. This most recent hearing that dropped on July 26th is just, it's pretty ironclad verification that this process is only going in one direction. I'm famous for saying that I could be wrong about this topic and so forth, and I will maintain that. I have a very nuanced approach to this topic, maybe even to a fault. And I'm not I've never seen a UFO. I think people that have seen a UFO, an unambiguous UFO, are far more justified than I am to be completely certain that the phenomenon is truly beyond next generation technology of unknown origin. But I think that the most recent hearing, you could argue very, very easily and persuasively that this kind of puts the nail in the coffin, that this is only going in one direction. I mean, let's just face it. If this was predicated on false information, if this was predicated on what a lot of the skeptics like to say, that it's a cult in the Pentagon, and there are persuasive people that have infiltrated the Pentagon and the intelligence committees and got them to believe that there's something here when there's not something here. And I'm doing that because it's such a frustrating and infuriating narrative that some of these debunkers and skeptics like to promote. It's an insult to my intelligence and to a lot of people's intelligences. I'm not saying that's not possible, but to put that forth like it's probable, I mean, come on. After we're going on 6 years now, and I think if this was all predicated on faulty information, I think the probability is actually that people would have come out of the U.S. government and been like, no, we got to stop this, right? There would have been a joint announcement by the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, and the Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, or whoever was prior to that, putting an end to this. It doesn't make the government look good. It promotes conspiracy theories. So I'm just gonna give my right hook and my left undercut. This is likely predicated on real information, intelligence that has been gathered of high fidelity, that paints a very compelling picture that there's a mystery out there. I just don't think we'd get here. I don't think we'd get to this place after 6 years if that wasn't the case. But maybe I'm just a gullible UFO fan and I don't know what I'm talking about. I think the second part of your question. What was the second part of your question? Sorry.
Initial thoughts on.
Initial thoughts. Yeah. So what has become crystal clear from this hearing, and it really disturbs me. It affects me psychologically. It's because I think it's so bad for society and civilization. What's become crystal clear here, and is that there's a contradiction going on. When we had the first hearing in May of 2022, we had the Director of Naval Intelligence, Scott Bray. And I think I always get his position confused, but it's like the Undersecretary for intelligence, security intelligence, something like that. But his name is Ronald Moultrie, very, very high up. In fact, I think he's the #1 guy in the DoD right now. I mean, technically, I guess Lloyd Austin is, but in some capacity, he's the #1 guy. They're career bureaucrats. And what has been established from this most recent hearing is that career bureaucrats apparently don't want to be transparent to the American public. They want to downplay this enigma as much as humanly possible. They want to couch everything they say in a meticulous and intentional way to give the impression that we don't really know what's going on, and it could all just be glitches in our radar systems. I mean, it would be, but so contrast that kind of impression that clearly people like Scott Bray, people like Ronald Moultrie, very unfortunately, people like the director of Aero, Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, this is the impression they give. Now, contrast that when you get direct witnesses that are not career bureaucrats. In the most recent hearing, we had David Grush, 14-year intelligence officer. And we had Commander David Fravor. I don't remember how many years he served, but many years. Top Gun graduate, probably one of the best aviators in the history of the world, frankly. He was the head of the VFA 41 Black Aces. He's a legend. And Ryan Graves, also a very highly accomplished aviator. I think he was one of the best America had at the time. And why is it that these people, even after being sworn in, why is it that they paint a completely different picture of UAP versus the picture people like Scott Bray and Ronald Moultrie and Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick paint? I think, okay, maybe I'm a gullible UFO fan and I don't know what I'm talking about. That's possible. The other possibility is I'm just kind of a little bit objective here, and it's obvious that they're trying to downplay the phenomenon because they don't want the DoD to look bad. They don't want to negatively impact their career aspirations. Maybe they don't want to upset higher ups in the Pentagon, but people that actually want to inform the American public, and because they think the American public has a need to know, a right to know, and should know ethically and morally. It seems like people who have that perspective fall in line with people like David Fravor and Ryan Graves and David Grush. And so this disparity in communication on the topic disturbs me to my soul. I find it highly problematic, highly troubling. And I think we've become so desensitized from a 70+ year cover up. We've become so desensitized that we don't have this inner turmoil that I'm having. We're just expected. Oh, that's just what they do. No. That's just what the DoD does. They downplay it. They obfuscate. They paint a picture that is not representative of the phenomenon. That's what they do. But no, I don't just say, oh, that's what they do, and I'm going to go have a candy bar. I don't do that. I'm sick to my stomach that this is going on. It's troubling. It's problematic. It's unethical. It's immoral. It's disgusting. Imagine if I tried to do something like this in a professional capacity. I don't know. Maybe I'd go to jail for that. But this is just the status quo when it comes to the national security establishment, and we just respond to that like it's normal. But I don't. I'm sick to my stomach about it. It disturbs me. That's kind of, I guess, that I don't want to keep going, but that's just what I'm going to say for now.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and again, to service members who have had experiences while on duty, or even just civilians who have had different experiences, to deny that for whatever reason, I think is wrong. I mean, the whole cover up to begin with was wrong, is wrong, I think. I mean, not that you can't make arguments for it or try to make rationalizations for it, but ultimately I don't think it's helped us as a civilization at all. But I actually I was really impressed with the hearing, the demeanor of the committee members. I thought they were taking it very seriously, and that was very impressive to me. That they were asking some really solid questions, so they were prepared, most of them, and that was pretty incredible to see. Were there any statements or even some of the questions that were asked by the committee members that stood out to you?
Yeah, I'm going to get to that. I just want to add, like, I'm not saying I know that Ronald Moultrie or Scott Bray or Donald or Sean Kirkpatrick. I don't know if they're lying, but I do get the impression that they're intentionally downplaying the topic. But I will say they might be lying. You know, Lou Elizondo said in an interview right after the first hearing, you know, pick your poison. They're either lying or they were not informed about the topic, which they're both problematic, because if you're engaging in a hearing about this topic, you should be informed about this topic at the very least. But what I wanted to add, I think this is really important, is, you know, in the first hearing and even in the second hearing with Sean Kirkpatrick, they talked about, well, the sensor data, we're not really sure. Sometimes it's a glitch. But then I would ask, okay, but what about satellite imagery? What about satellite imagery? What about satellite imagery? I did that 3 times on purpose to be dramatic. But recently, James Fox was on the Joe Rogan podcast. And I'm just going to take, I don't think James Fox would make this up. Let's be real, people. And he said he talked to Chris Mellon. And I'm going to give the rendition of this to the best of my recollection. I'm sure the core of what I say is accurate. And Chris Mellon mentioned something about having seen satellite data. And James Fox is like, oh God, you got to tell me. I've been involved in this topic my whole life. Please tell me. And then Chris Mellon said, well, the only reason I'm going to tell you this is because former DNI John Ratcliffe has already broached this.
Right.
And according to James Fox said that, according to James Fox, Chris Mellon said, I've seen the satellite imagery. It's like 4K. And James Fox is like, well, can you go any further? And Chris Mellon is like, let's just put it this way. It's as good as you can imagine. And Chris Mellon is referencing UAP. I don't know, maybe flying saucers, maybe triangles, but nothing that's reminiscent of an airplane or a missile or a drone with a propeller and an obvious means of propulsion. So my question would be, if let's just call it the NRO, the NGA, if these organizations have been taking 4K imagery or high fidelity imagery of UAP for decades, why are we having these hearings where people like Scott Bray and Ronald Moultrie are talking about other sensor systems, and, well, it might be a glitch? Can you just tell us if it's real? Like, why are we going through this Fox artificial evolution pattern? What is this? I'm taking crazy pills. But anyways, I'm sorry, I just had to get that out there. So basically, I'm sorry, you were asking me, like, what did I think of the panelists?
I was gonna say, what was there anything that any of the questions that stood out to you, or or some of the statements that were made that stood out? But I do want to say, yeah, with Moultrie and
It's sickening.
Kirkpatrick, no matter how you want to paint it, I do not feel as an American citizen that they're acting in our best interest and that they're actually trying to do their job and take it seriously. Whether they're uninformed or incompetent doesn't even matter to me. If they can't do the job, then get somebody who will.
Absolutely.
But yeah, so was any of the panelists that asked specific questions or any statements made by any of the witnesses that really stood out or maybe surprised you or made you think?
Yeah, so I think I was watching it today. I got 2 hours into it. The vast majority of it. Yesterday, I think I watched it all, but I was like out of it. So, but I got it. I got the vast majority of it. So, one thing that really stood out to me, is that David Grush literally said that he was fearing for his life at certain points after coming forward, about this topic. And, that I found really disturbing. This is so bizarre. So not only, like, kind of factoring into what you were just saying, not only are people like Scott Bray and Ronald Moultrie and Sean Kirkpatrick not really fulfilling their obligation to inform the people, but it gets even worse. There are people, I think what David Grush said, who were behind the reprisals, as he said, it was senior leadership in various governmental agencies. I don't know if he was tying that into fearing for his life, but I assume so. But the reprisals, he said, I think he was saying they were using tradecraft. Like, these are sophisticated people, right? They're not just going to willy-nilly threaten people. They're going to do it in a way that's as I would assume, as dramatic and disturbing and traumatic. And they're trying to get David Grush to do their bidding, and they're going to go. They apparently have gone so far to make him feel like his life was under threat. Now, he wasn't able to go into that in any depth because there's still an open investigation with the intelligence community inspector general. But that I found that really problematic because it just ties into this stupid cover up as I see it, and this stupid obfuscating and misleading that's been going on for 70 years. I'm taking crazy pills. Yes, I'm going to go crazy. I'm going to go nuts. I'm going to lose my sanity over this because it's so absurd. I'm not going to walk around and say the sun is shining and the green grass is so green and I love hearing the birds chirp. It's so beautiful. No, I'm going to lose my mind and become an absolute maniac. I'm going to go crazy. I'm probably going to institute it into a facility where they're going to look at me and say, you're crazy. You're beyond hope. We're just going to give you this elixir cocktail of medication and pray for the best. That's probably what's going to happen to me if this continues on. So I'll get that. So I want every person watching James Iandoli podcasts engaging in the phenomenon to get on their damn knees, pray to whoever their deity is, that I can weather this storm, because if we don't get disclosure soon, I'm going to explode. Okay, sorry. Whew.
It's all good.
Sorry about that. But yeah, so that's so that stood out to me. I mean, I could go on and on, but I'll just keep it at that, and we can continue the conversation because there were so many nuggets in that hearing that you could write a book about it, frankly.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And you know, kind of what you're talking about, an example here is like the effect of the cover up, right? I mean, it's what, you know, how are people supposed to think if there's been this, you know, deception on the subject for so many years? And David Grush attested to that as well, both in the News Nation interview with Ross Coulthart and the congressional hearing, that there has been, you know, again, for accuracy, disinformation, misinformation, deception campaigns against the American people and everybody really, regarding this subject. You know, the effect that's going to have is tremendous. So, you know, I think that's part of what we're seeing now is this information is coming out. It's been coming out for the last several years, and there's like the collective cognitive dissonance, right? And you know, I've said it before that I think, you know, the idea of non-human intelligence, or aliens or extraterrestrials, or, you know, whatever you want to consider, what's behind the UFO phenomenon, is like one thing, and people could kind of come to terms with that idea. Oh, we're being visited by another intelligence. I think the idea that to people that they've been lied to by their institutions and their authorities is what is the most jarring for people. I think that's, you know, nobody wants to believe they've been deceived. Nobody wants to believe they've been tricked. And you know, there's that great quote. I forget. I'm
going to look it up right now. I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, it was Mark Twain, the Mark Twain quote. That, you know, it's easier for people to believe a lie than it is for people to believe that they've been lied to.
Let's do it, baby. It's easier to fool people,
yeah,
than it is to convince them that they have been fooled. And you know what? Funny enough, you know, I a while back I did a video comparing this topic to The Matrix.
It's a great video. I love that one.
Thank you. And you know, I'm gonna set up a scene as best as my recollection provides, but there's a scene where Morpheus takes Neo into the Matrix, if you will, and he's walking in the Matrix. It's like it's not really the Matrix. It's kind of like a training program, if you will. And there's people all over the place. And then he sees a woman in the red dress, and you know, he fancies her, so he looked too long. He didn't keep his guard up. I don't remember the scene that well, but I think after that, Morpheus said, "Look, the people in the Matrix have been so conditioned to that reality that they will fight. They will literally fight to keep it maintained and persisting. And I kind of feel we're sort of in that situation in some respect, as a result of the misinformation, disinformation tactics and campaigns that have been orchestrated by our intelligence services, so much money going into it, so much advanced tradecraft, that we're at a point now where you see a lot of scientists, they don't want to even give this any credence. They don't want to, there's so many people are fighting back against it. And I think part of that is because of the stigma that has been attached to this topic. Of course, I do think there would be a stigma inherently, because it's just a weird topic. I think there would be to some extent, but obviously, in my opinion, the intelligence services put that on steroids. And so it's like, we are truly in the matrix, if you will. We are in a sense fighting against reality in the name of rationality and reality. That's how twisted this whole thing is.
Yeah, it's like the fabric of the very foundation of what people believe is real. And again, that gets back to like authoritative figures, telling you something for year after year after year after year, and the contrary is the actual reality of it. And yeah, the Matrix, I think, is a great analogy, because in that scene, I think Morpheus is saying that people, they rely so much on the Matrix itself that that's all they know. So the idea that you're going to kind of now put this reality on people, which should have been that way from the beginning, then you wouldn't have this issue. But now, you're dealing with two things. You're dealing with, okay, this is real, and then inherently what goes with that is that you were lied to for 80 years. So it's not just one or the other, it's both. And again, I think more so than the idea of non-human intelligence, or what people consider aliens are interacting with us or have visited us, it's people have to kind of let go. It messes up the entire worldview of what they think was real to begin with. So I mean, I can tell you that just from having experiences, that it has a similar effect, in that it could be traumatic, in the sense that even if you have a positive experience, it could be traumatic because it upsets your entire worldview, and you have to rethink everything. And that's kind of like, even in the Matrix, Morpheus is saying we don't usually unplug people after a certain age because they can't handle it. And that's kind of what we're seeing now, is like people have to readjust their entire thinking, because if this one thing is real, if the UFOs are real and the UFO reality is real, what else did I get wrong? Which is basically almost everything, potentially, and that's what I think is the most disturbing for people, is that whole process. And now we have to go through it collectively, I think. But I think the younger generations are more conditioned, and maybe that's even by design. I have no idea, to the idea. I mean, if you ask a younger person about, oh, do you think ETs exist, or UFOs and stuff are visiting us, most of them will probably be like, yeah, I think, at least younger people I've seen around here. I don't know in different areas. But getting back to the hearing, there were a lot of really, one thing kind of about that was that, the pilots, don't report UAP so much because I believe, I don't know if it was Fravor or Graves who said, during their annual checkup, they could take away your flight status, because they can basically say, oh, if you're seeing these things, you're not well to fly, basically. But again, having
so they were I think the claim was that they were actually sometimes destroy, like if they took footage of UAP maybe on their iPhone or something, they would actually destroy it because they don't have to deal with the repercussions.
Right. Yeah. So, having this hearing occurs is a huge step forward, because it's pushing more on the transparency of, well, people can report more, even though you know, a number of years ago, there was supposed to be a reporting process and everything that the Navy was going to use to improve on reports and allow for more reports without repercussions. I, you know, again, we hear about this other Air Force incident that happened where the congressman was able to go to the base and see the picture of this UAP. So that's apparently a case that wasn't reported. The pilot, I guess, is some kind of whistleblower that Burchett went to go try to talk to, and they wouldn't let him talk to. So we're still seeing that kind of pushback.
Yeah, and I think the reason we're still seeing that kind of pushback is because, and I think Dr. Gary Nolan has touched on this. I probably have touched on it. It's a very clear interpretation, but the problem with disclosure is it's like pregnancy. You can't be 30% pregnant, right? So the problem with disclosure is once you stop the song and dance that's been going on for 70 plus years, and it just disturbs me because, you know, the skeptics and debunkers are telling me that I'm gullible and that I'm have gullible analysis. Meanwhile, the infinite irony, in my opinion, is that they're the ones that have been manipulated and persuaded by propaganda orchestrated by the U.S. government and other governments. So that let that be one of the great ironies of the history of our species. But the thing about disclosures, you can't do partial disclosure. So I think they have an inherent incentive to constantly give the perception that this could be weather phenomena. It could be an adversary. If it did present some kind of advanced maneuvering or technological capabilities, then, my friends, it could be a glitch, right? The moment you say, okay, y'all, we have all this corroborative data, and it's completely clear that something did XYZ, and there's nothing in any military inventory in the world that could do XYZ. Now that suddenly changes the conversation. But it's very clear to me that the DoD and the intelligence agencies, they want to prevent that. Like, they want to prevent that for eternity. And that's what's kind of going on right now. And it's just so absurd. It's mind-blowingly absurd. And I'm sorry. Why are you going, like, at some point you have to ask yourself, like, if you're a skeptic or a debunker, at some point you have to ask yourself, well, maybe there's a conflict of interest. Maybe the reason they're constantly downplaying it is not because they don't have the high fidelity data, but it's because they want to paint a very false picture to the public. Maybe there's a reason that people like Ryan Graves and Commander David Fravor and David Grush and multitudes of credible people that have come out of the woodwork, maybe there's a reason that their testimony and painting of the UAP issue is in such contrast to the government's. Maybe it's not because they're all gullible and they're not capable of rendering accurately what they saw and what their technological military equipment showed them. Maybe it's simply because there's a conflict of interest. Like, if you're a debunker and skeptic, you might just want to consider that for a few moments. Like, I'm not saying you have to, like, believe 100% that we're dealing with non-human intelligence or beyond next generation technology of unknown origin. But I don't know. I don't know. Maybe it's kind of a good idea to give a little bit of credence to the probability, to give a little bit more probability to that possibility than this black and white binary thinking that a lot of them do. And they perceive it as like, this is what intelligence looks like. This is what smarts looks like. This is what a high IQ looks like. I don't know, man. The world is not black and white. It's not binary. I don't know. I don't think it's a 1 in 10 million chance that some of these UFOs are of non-human intelligence. I actually think there's I think there's a reasonable probability that some of them are, after 70 plus years of people saying they've seen the same things over and over again. FOIA documents that have been attained where people inside the government speak about this topic very differently than they do publicly, and now it's still going, and now you have whistleblowers coming forward. Let's not forget that David Grush had 2 people vouching for him publicly in the June 5th debrief article. Jonathan Gray of NASIC, National Air and Space Intelligence Center, as well as Colonel, I can't remember his name, but
yeah,
former
I'm blanking
colonel.
on the name. Yeah.
I had it, and then I'm like, you're doing so good right now. You're doing so good. And the devil in my head's like, I'm going to make you forget. So that's kind of what happened. Carly Nell, you can't stop me, Satan. Not today, Satan. Not today. Carly Nell, baby, you ain't gonna stop this. Nothing gonna stop this. Nothing in heaven and earth is gonna stop this. But anyways, Carl E. Nell, former colonel in the military, I think in the Army, colonel, obviously very, very high level. And now he's a current executive in an aerospace company. He vouched for what whistleblower David Grush said. And even Carl E. Nell even spoke about his character and said that David Grush is beyond reproach, right? So,
Yeah.
I don't know, just you're a skeptic, you're a debunker, fine, but why does it have to be so binary? Why can't you be like, well, after all of this, maybe there's something to it? But that's not what I see on Twitter. That's not what I see from a lot of these vocal skeptics. They're so binary. It's either I have smoking gun evidence and it's here, or I don't. Well, I don't know. There can be a lot of indicators. There can be a preponderance of evidence that's not equivalent to smoking gun proof that can, I don't know, maybe it should persuade you not to be so certain that there's nothing to this.
Yeah. And I mean, at this point, with everything that's gone on, it almost seems that it's flipped, that the conspiratorial thinking is on behalf of the debunkers, because some of the hoops, the mental hoops that you have to jump through to think that this is all some kind of trick it just doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense. You have multiple people, Lou Elizondo, right, putting his name, his career, and pension, everything on the line to come forward to talk about this, to write a book. Like, no, like I don't think so.
Exactly.
If I were him, right, I don't know if I could just walk. Even if I knew what he knew, I don't know if I could just walk off my job. That it took me my entire career to work up to. To come out and just talk about this with no guarantee that you had like a really safe landing spot, right? He's got a wife and kids and stuff, and now arguably plenty of other people, but now David Grush, right, left his position to come out and talk about this, which is I mean, nobody's gonna do that for just to fool people in the Pentagon about this, because they think they're going to get some kind of aerospace contract or whatever people think that they're going to do. It just doesn't make sense, because he already had a great thing going for him. Why would he turn around and throw that away and take a gamble on UFO defense money, right? Which is not like a thing. So that's that. But what do you think about some of David Grush's testimony regarding non-human intelligence, recovered vehicles, and as I'm trying to think of the exact term, as he said, non-human biologics.
Yeah, that was really interesting.
I mean, because the importance of it is that this is being said on the congressional record under oath. That's a difference here.
Yeah, there were some people who were saying, well, we learned nothing new, so this doesn't matter. But I try to respond and say, no, well, there's a difference between going on a podcast and mentioning this information and doing it under oath, under the penalty of law, amongst the National Security Subcommittee or whatever it was. But it makes sense to me that there have been recovered crash vehicles and biologics, because to me it makes sense, because the cover-up has been so over the top. The lengths that the U.S. government has gone to lead the public astray on this. I mean, you would have to have a really powerful incentive to do that. I don't think the government did it because they're just inherently evil. I think they did it because they felt a justification to do it. Now, granted, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? So I'm not giving them a pass or anything, but to keep the cover up this long, knowing the stakes, they're not dumb. They know that this cover up could end at any time, and that if it did, the blowback would be heavy. But they said, we don't care. We're taking that risk anyway. So what would motivate them to do that? And you could I'm not sure I even totally agree with this argument, but you could argue that if all they ever experienced were things in the sky and radar fidelity collection of them, or even video footage of them, and that was the complete extent of their high fidelity data, maybe if that's the way it was, maybe the cover-up would not have lasted close to 90 years, according to David Grush. And so recovering vehicles and craft kind of changes the equation quite a bit, because now it becomes a much bigger national security concern. Now it's like, because you're not really, I don't think you're conceivably ever going to really be able to back engineer something just by seeing it in the sky and getting radar collections. I think that's kind of far-fetched. But if you actually get to the artifacts, if you get the actual equipment, then there's a possibility that you could back engineer it. So I can see why, you know, colonels and generals were like, you know, we really don't want to publicize this, because it becomes such an inherent issue regarding having superiority over our adversaries. So it makes sense that this is the foundation of the cover-up, because it's only something like this, it could be argued, that would lead to the cartoonish, absurd level of secrecy that we've had over all these years. Because ultimately, what is the inevitable outcome if you back engineer these craft? The inevitable outcome is you rule the world. It's just that simple. No one's going to mess with you. Like if we had a fleet of Tic Tacs, let's say we had, you know, 1,000 Tic Tacs at the ready within the United States military. Well, now Russia or China can't do anything, right? Well, we could intercept any hypersonic weapon they had. We could have our stuff constantly over their military installations, over their silos that have nuclear ICBMs at the ready. They could hover there for like all day, could be unmanned. It could hover there 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Like they would essentially, our adversaries would basically be in a cage. Like if you launch a missile, we're going to blow it up 2 seconds after it comes out of the silo. So go for it, right? And then the United States would rule the world. We could have any influence we wanted. I'm not even saying I'm an American. I don't even think that's a good thing. No one should have that kind of asymmetric advantage, because it would corrupt people's minds. There's no way anyone is going to remain moral and righteous and good when you have that kind of power. I don't even think there's not a government in the world that I think would do that. It would corrupt you. They say power corrupts, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. So you could make the argument the first person that back engineers this equipment is just going to get absolutely corrupted. So what I'm saying is you can kind of understand that if they recovered something from 1933 in Magenta, Italy, as the story goes, and then they kept recovering stuff, they don't want to talk about this, because there's a reason they might perceive it as the biggest national security issue ever. And during the hearing, David Grush was asked about satellite imagery as it pertains to crash retrievals. And he said, well, I can't talk about that in an open setting. We have to do it in a classified setting. So if these crash retrievals are happening, I would assume that they have mechanisms in place with their satellite systems to watch these UAP and see whenever one is going to crash or land and be abandoned. And then once they see that, because I'm sure they're constantly monitoring it to the best of their ability, once they see that, they will get a retrieval program. And there's probably, I don't know if it's true, but I'm sure there's retrieval capabilities throughout the world. They're not just stationed in one place. I mean, we've heard recently about how the Five Eyes are all have an agreement in regards to back engineering UAP and potentially maybe even recovering of these UAP. So I'm sure this net is all over the world. Would you really want to publicize this reality so that now other adversarial nations are going to be like, okay, how do we monitor these UAP? How do we know when they crash or when they land and are being abandoned? You wouldn't want to do that, because again, when we're talking about national security, this is probably like maybe the biggest national security you can imagine. You back engineer it, you rule the world. Now, I guess I'm making an argument for the cover up, but it doesn't completely work, because it's been said that maybe even China and Russia have their own recoveries, and it's like it's a balancing act. Yes, other nations would become aware of it, but like other nations know about nuclear power too. Doesn't mean they're going to be able to duplicate nuclear weaponry. There's only a number of nations on the planet that can do it. But maybe the most important point to drive home is that disclosure is inevitable anyways. So if you elongate the cover up for as long as possible, all you're ultimately going to do, it could be argued, is you're going to compromise the integrity of your country. Because once we get disclosed, let's say the DOD is so adamant about secrecy and the intelligence agencies are so adamant about secrecy that by some miracle they can go 10 more years with a cover up. Well, in 10 years from now, if we finally get disclosure, the blowback and the disruption to our republic is going to be exponentially worse than if they come clean now. So let's just cut the you know what and have transparency so that everyone can be benefited by it, including the government.
Yeah, and I think one of the mission statements for OSAP was that one of the biggest threats that the United States faced in regards to UAP was not like some kind of hostile UAP attack, actually. One of the biggest threats was that a foreign country or adversary would develop the technology faster than us or create a breakthrough somehow. Maybe because if they have a program that's not as siloed as ours are, and we say we have like 20 people working on one thing, but they have 200, those aren't good odds. And they could potentially create a breakthrough before us, which would be, in regards to the United States, would be terrible,
Yeah.
So I think at this point, and we've heard the stories, right? And both from Bob Lazar and ironically, Dr. Eric Davis, even though they have their own, Eric Davis has his own opinion of Lazar, they both said like, okay, every 7 to 8 years, they'll bring it out. They'll try to make advances on it. And if they can't, they'll put it back away for another few years and try to do that cycle until we can finally make progress. So, that's been a constant theme that we've heard in like the UFO lore. On the more extreme side, they'll say, oh no, we actually have made breakthroughs and we have secret technology that mimics UFOs, and that's part of the reason why they don't want to disclose this, because then they have to disclose at least the reality of some of those technologies. So that's another dilemma that comes up in regards to disclosure. But I think the testimony that was given by David Grush was incredible. Again, for under oath on the congressional record, he's talking about retrieved vehicles. He said after speaking to 40 witnesses,
I think it was over 40 witnesses.
Yeah, and that's potentially a number of those witnesses have been working on the UFO or UAP legacy programs.
I think that's the indication. Yeah, they were direct firsthand knowledge witnesses, some of them working in those programs. Yeah.
And when he said non-human biologics, he qualified it and said that was the opinion of somebody has direct knowledge of the program, who is currently still working on the program, which that's huge, right? He's saying that the programs are ongoing as we speak. I mean, even if we suspected that, him putting that on the congressional record is huge. And the crazy thing is that the ICIG, the Intelligence Community Inspector General, and apparently other people within Congress have all the actionable intelligence regarding those claims.
Yeah.
Grush had given over 11 hours of testimony, program names, program code numbers, locations, witnesses, names. I mean, they had, and potentially that's why we're seeing all the forward movement, because to some extent the gig is up. These people are
Absolutely
informed, right? And they can actually investigate and follow up on these claims.
That's what makes the continued position of the DOD and intelligence agencies so disturbing. The jig is up, but they're still persisting with this. It's absolute madness.
Yeah, and like we were talking about earlier, there was a kind of generic I guess you want to call it like a public statement by
It's like
Susan Goff.
it's like a template or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just like, basically there's nothing, the claims aren't genuine, or as there's no proof of extraterrestrial, or
Yeah,
and they
I think she focuses on Arrow, that to this day, Arrow has found nothing to verify the claims that there's recovered extraterrestrial craft or biologics, something to that effect, when it's like, okay, but Arrow doesn't necessarily have even a fraction of the access they need to verify that information. And we don't even know if Arrow is making the effort to look into that. I mean, if David Grush said it himself, he informed Sean Kirkpatrick of what he knew, and Sean Kirkpatrick never followed up. So it does look very plausible that Arrow and Sean Kirkpatrick potentially are simply not pursuing this so that they can maintain plausible deniability. Oh, we haven't verified it. Well, yeah, you're not going to verify something if you don't actually do the investigative work to verify it. And Chris Mellon recently said to Chris Cuomo in an interview, because Chris Cuomo made a very good point. He said, these people are not going to tell on themselves. You can't have the DOD investigating the DOD, or intelligence agencies investigating the intelligence agencies, which is what Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, Ronald Moultrie, and Scott Bray are, from my perspective. You need an outside independent effort, because so there's no conflict of interest. And Chris Mellon went on to say, Chris Cuomo went on to say the Congress needs to do it because they don't have that conflict of interest. Although there actually might be some exceptions to that rule. Maybe some of them have been compromised, who knows? But by and large, they don't have that conflict of interest. And so, unfortunately, I think that until there is an independent source doing the legwork to get to the bottom of this, and potentially also people getting threatened that they'll lose their job if they don't cooperate, maybe until this kind of pressure is put forward to our intelligence agencies, we will not make progress. So that's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, and I I think somebody should ask Susan Goff, if there's no accuracy to any of these claims, why is Congress and Senate and all these people within the government continually refining NDAA language, making these kind of demands if there's nothing to it? Like, why? I would love to hear a kind of response on that. But yeah, so they mentioned there could be following hearings. I think that is going to definitely be something that we're going to see. And hopefully with more people like David Grush, with some kind of first whistleblower testimony, or somebody that had been actively working on those programs.
Yeah, one of the interesting highlights from the hearing that a lot of people have cited was where Ryan Graves spoke about a Vandenberg incident from 2003, where a large group of Boeing contractors. So it's already interesting. We're not talking about one person or two people, but a large group of contractors, so highly corroborated. And their testimony is utterly unambiguous. It's not like they saw Venus in the sky. So this happened near a launch facility where it is alleged that a very large 100-yard red square, 100-yard red square approaches the base from the ocean at low altitude over one of the launch facilities. And I don't know what the launch facility is. Is that an ICBM place? I don't really know, but it remained there for 45 seconds. Okay. I don't think a bunch of people who are contractors for Boeing are going to think they saw something that's the size of a football field, very large, spread square and glowing, if they didn't see it. I think the likelihood is they probably saw that. And then Graves went on to explain similar events within 24 hours happened. Reports of other sightings around the base, including aggressive behaviors. And he also said there was official documentation of the events. So that was a great highlight from the hearing. And I think it just goes to highlight how obnoxiously absurd the cover-up is. I mean, this stuff is happening over our ICBM and military infrastructure, and it's not just like a tic-tac. although a Tic Tac is pretty amazing too. A Tic Tac that's able to infiltrate a carrier strike group and do whatever it wants with impunity. And there's nothing the carrier strike group can do. Well, that's pretty profound, but it's so much further than that. There's turning off ICBM installations, turning them on. That we've heard stories of that. Most of the time, they're just surveilled. And I think this is also part of why the U.S. government doesn't want to be transparent about this. They don't want to have to tell the public that their most powerful weapons of mass destruction are being monitored and sometimes even meddled with. But see, that this is the thing about the phenomena. It goes so much further. Then there's all these stories about stuff in our oceans. Like this is why, like, I feel like I'm going to have to get myself into a mental institution in the not too distant future if this cover up continues, because it is so this phenomena is so pervasive. It's everywhere. It's everywhere. It's in our skies. It's in our oceans. And on top of it all, we have stories of abductions. So it's highly intimate. It's not just our radar systems and people in the cockpit of an F-18 seeing these things. Apparently, and I think there's a lot of good data for this, people are being abducted, and the non-human intelligences are abducting human beings of all different ages and genders against their will and doing things against their will and then returning them to their beds. Like, right. This is so utterly explosive. And I guess that's kind of part of why the U.S. government and other governments don't want to open this Pandora's box, because it's not just things in our skies, but it's also they're monitoring our military and meddling with our military. It's not just things in the skies, but it's also there's stories of school landings. West Hall, 1966, aerial school, 94 maybe.
94, yeah.
And there's but more than that, right? So they're also playing footsie with our school children. The phenomenon is playing footsie with our school children. Everybody, wake up, right? And then there's stuff in our oceans, for God's sakes. There's a famous story. I don't recollect it exactly, but I think Lou Elizondo told this story. So has Commander David Fravor, where they were doing tests with like a cruise missile, and then when the cruise missile goes into the water, they collect it. Well, one of the times they collected it, the guy was going down to collect it, and he sees this thing raise up in the water the size of an island. Right, it's dark black, and it took whatever was left from that test, whatever the shell of the cruise missile or whatever that is, it collected it, and then it receded into the ocean. Right, like that's what we're dealing with. And so for a couple bureaucrats in the Pentagon to want to not let the rest of the American public and the world at large know this disturbs me to my soul.
Well, and I don't want to go too far into it because I don't know how much of this aligns exactly with David Grush's claims or the testimony that he gave privately. But, you know, one of the things that Ross Coulthart brought up in the News Nation interview, that and it wasn't as clearly addressed in the hearing, although I thought it was brought up, but they kind of got sidetracked a bit, was potential agreements between humans and non-human intelligence. So a potential relationship. I mean, it would imply contact. It would imply communication. Is the United States government having some kind of arrangement with non-human intelligence? And that is something that would be incredibly disturbing, I think, to the American people, at least, and anybody else watching. But my thinking is, I'm not sure how aligned that is with what David Grush had learned in interviewing people and being given that information, or is that a conclusion he came to on his own? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, I remember from in the hearing, he was asked about that, and he's like, well, I can't talk about that in a open setting. I have to do it in a classified setting, which indicates he learned probably he probably learned it from in some kind of official capacity. Otherwise, why could he not speak about it in a public setting? Yeah, it's extremely disturbing. And that's how pervasive this is. it might not just be everything I just covered in my most recent rant. I've done a lot of rants on your show so far, but it may even be more intimate than everything I said, up into and including contractual agreements with the NHI from governments. It's incredibly disturbing. And I'm going to go into it real quickly. I have a hypothesis called alien AI hypothesis.
I was going to ask you about that anyways. Yeah.
Yeah. So the basic theme of this hypothesis is that everything is not the way it seems. Let's and this is an optimistic approach. Obviously, I don't know, but just because it is an optimistic approach, it doesn't mean that everything they're doing to fulfill this is moral. You know, America. We go to war. We've been going to war for thousands of years. I don't know if people know this. They should know this, but you cannot fight a war without killing civilians. Every war that is fought, civilians are killed. You have to be There was this Navy SEAL. I can't remember his name, but he's a famous Navy SEAL guy. He runs a podcast. He said something that struck me for a long time. He said, in order to win a war, you literally have to be willing to kill civilians. Because obviously, like you're shelling areas, you're dropping bombs. Yeah, you're going to kill innocent people. No matter how careful you are, you're going to make it so that completely innocent bystanders are going to lose their life because of this war that you are intent and committed to employing, right? So, you know, life is messy. Morality is a complicated subject. You know, it's like the topic with the 2 bombs we dropped in Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Was that justified to stop the war? Was it not justified? Morality is not black and white. It just isn't. There's all kinds of circumstances where you have to do unsavory things for the greater good. There are arguments about that. I'm not making any arguments about that. I'm just saying that there are debates about that. So this would factor into my alien AI hypothesis. I have been very suspicious, looking over the limited amount of literature that I have, that what is occurring is a concerted effort by various intelligences to get the human civilization where they want it to go. And it will culminate with disclosure. So it's interesting that, so maybe what happens when we finally do get disclosure is the way our psychology will be impacted will start to eradicate and dismantle our psychosis, our collective psychosis when it comes to war and other areas. And they came to the analysis through their game planning, through their artificial intelligence, if you want to be woo-woo, maybe through some of their clairvoyant capabilities, all combined, that they had to do X in order to get Y. And I'm not saying I agree with this. I'm not saying this is true. This is statistically, my hypothesis is probably wrong, but it's my pet hypothesis. And so I've always felt that there has been an intentional baiting into the cover-up through multiple factors. We can start with UFOs crashing. Well, what if UFOs really aren't crashing? And when we shoot UFOs out of the sky, what if we are shooting them out of the sky, but they're allowing themselves to be shot out of the sky? Like, what if all of these parameters that have emerged over the decades have been instituted in some kind of operation, manipulation operation, if you want to call it, for a specific outcome? So it does seem to me that we have been baited into the cover-up. There's a famous term, maybe Whitley Strieber coined it, I don't know, but it's that the non-human intelligences are the architects of the secrecy, which I think is pretty much self-evident and transparent. If the NHIs wanted to stop the cover-up, they could do it in an afternoon just by having one of their craft show up in an area where people could take ample footage of it. So there's a question of, well, why has there been no smoking gun evidence within the public domain over all these decades? Well, I don't know. I mean, if they're able to turn on and off nuclear ICBMs through all that shielding, then maybe they're able to, maybe they have all this kind of weird technology where they know where everybody is when a sighting occurs. They can manipulate people not to take pictures, maybe, or if they do end up getting a picture off, they can alter the imagery. I know skeptics in the bunkers are going to have a field day with that, but I can easily counter that with, well, I think our species might be able to do stuff like that 5,000 years from now, right? Like during the medieval times, if you were to talk about the potential of what everything an iPhone could do, the greatest minds and scientists and debunkers and skeptics during that time would be like, that's never going to happen. And here's why that's never going to happen, or that's ridiculous. You're ridiculous. You're coming up with crazy things. Meanwhile, we have iPhones that do all kinds of crazy stuff. So, and then, you know, that alleged agreement with non-human intelligence, maybe they did that to further entrench the cover-up. And so one of the things I've said regarding my hypothesis is, if we would have gotten disclosure in 1947 with the alleged recovery of an alien vehicle close to Roswell, then a lot of the changes that are inevitably going to be made now when we get disclosure wouldn't have been made then. Is it possible that the changes of getting the psychological, sociological changes of getting disclosure now versus then will be much better for our human trajectory? I don't really know, but it's all possible that intertwined with their own self-interest, because maybe they do want to experiment on us. Maybe they do like it for scientific interest and it just wouldn't surprise me if we've been baited into the cover-up. And it's almost hard not to believe. In my opinion, it's almost hard not to believe we've been baited into the cover-up, because the phenomenon could break the cover-up at any time. So their behaviors throughout the many decades we've been dealing with this in the modern age is meticulously it seems to be meticulously orchestrated in a way where we have this balancing act, where on the one hand, you could argue it's obvious the phenomenon's here because of all the witness testimony, FOIA documentations, people coming out of the woodworks. Right now, UFO hearings, documentaries, books, experiencers, abductees having a common thread. Amazingly, they say they've seen the same thing over and over again. So on the one hand, it's like the non-human intelligences have orchestrated and created this environment where it's easy to believe, but it's also easily not to believe. So you have this kind of fine-tuning, orchestrated, manufactured dynamics dichotomy that could only be produced by a much higher intelligences utilizing weird technologies that we can't even put our head around. And so maybe, but on the other hand, this all inevitably is leading up to disclosure. So this like 70 or 90 year period where we've been having all these experiences with denials from the government, but so much evidence in the public domain where it's hard to believe governments are telling the whole truth. Maybe this whole thing is like orchestrated by the multiple intelligences, and it's done, at least according to their perspective, in our favor, and the benefit will culminate in disclosure, and the trajectory that our civilization goes post-disclosure will be completely different had they not done what they did in terms of the psychological manipulation operation that's just would be well beyond our perspective. But one of the things I always think is like, I actually think the cover-up, it could be argued, is not in our favor, because it in a weird way, you could argue the cover-up actually gives these non-human intelligences capacities to direct our destiny and our environment more than if they would just reveal the truth. But I guess that's kind of debatable and kind of an abstract idea. But anyways, I'm going to give the mic to you after all that.
Yeah, I mean, that actually makes sense. There was, the idea that I think it was like, yeah, Carl Jung had a quote, and it was something along the lines of, your subconscious will, it's like your subconscious will rule your mind, and you'll call it fate, or something like that. I'm totally destroying the quote, but it's basically saying your unconscious or your subconscious thinking is ruling most of your life, and you call it fate or destiny because you don't know any better. And that's kind of the situation. Whereas if we're unaware of the UFO reality, and it has more of an ability to guide or influence us than if we could be aware of it and transparent about it and say, actually these UAPs are here, they're doing this, and this is how it's affecting us, because we're almost denying the entire thing altogether with the cover-up. But I did want to ask you about disclosure and post disclosure. You have a channel called Post Disclosure World. What number one? And let me just start with number one. What do you think it's going to take at this point for some kind of disclosure? You know, I know we talked about disclosure as being a process, not an event. But considering everything that's gone on for the last several years, we've seen multiple hearings now, but and it's progressed quite a lot. But what do you think it's going to take for disclosure to occur? What's going to be the line that we have to cross?
So I'm going to get to that real quick. I love what you said about the subconscious. I think we underestimate the degree to which these intelligences could manipulate and direct us over decades, because for one, because we're just not we're not thinking about it, and we're not contemplating it. But for two, they're so much more technologically advanced. They may understand how the butterfly effect, if you will, works
Right.
way better than we do. But I just was looking up in my Google Docs because I did a video as part. I actually have a series on my YouTube channel that covers alien AI hypothesis. It's actually the only playlist that I have on my whole channel. And I have an axiom that I created that applies to it. And the axiom goes as follows: the more advanced a civilization becomes, the more calculated all of their actions become, and the more adept they become at influencing the future precisely how they want it to be. So, you know, I'm being a little anthropomorphic here, but if they do want to, if they do want to veer away as much as possible from chance, then it only makes sense that they're going to try to influence us as much as humanly possible. Getting to your question, what it's going to take to truly get disclosure is going to be two things, in my opinion. It's going to take an unambiguous admission by our institution, the United States government, or some other equivalent institution, governmental institution. And it's also going to take smoking gun evidence that is so compelling that the rational analysis is that what is being depicted is technologies that are not known to exist amongst the human technological apparatus, if you will. And I think until that happens, we won't get what I sometimes like to refer to as UFO confirmation. We won't get UFO confirmation until that happens. I think after 6 years of this happening, the circumstantial evidence has only gotten better. And I do think circumstantial evidence holds weight, but it's just not enough to say that we finally passed into a post-disclosure world. And, you know, look, it's possible that if we could see some of that satellite imagery, I don't know if we ever will, because that's dealing with highly sensitive sensors, but okay, don't give us satellite imagery. And if, by the way, I want to touch on this because I don't know, I don't think this has been highlighted enough. When former director of national intelligence, John Ratcliffe was on Fox News, like he blatantly said there's satellite imagery.
Yeah.
And I think he said it again. And it was so weird. He was on another show a little after that, and they asked him about, can you speak about aliens? And his answer was so bizarre. He's like, he stuttered. He's like, I can't speak about that. And from my perspective, he wasn't saying that like because he's trying to be humorous. He's saying that like, oh, I know about the aliens. I know about the crash retrieval program, but it's classified, so I can't speak about it. Like, that's kind of like the way he was saying I can't speak about it was like, that's what was like the vibes I got. It's like he knew a lot more. But in that Fox News initial interview, it's amazing what he said. He said that well, there have been sightings that we know about, but we haven't yet shared with you. There have been incidents where we see a UAP go beyond the sound barrier, but there's no sonic boom. He also explicitly said that we cannot duplicate the capacities that we're witnessing from these UAP. He basically said, yes, we're dealing with non-human technology without saying, yes, we're dealing with non-human technology. And it's just getting a little weird when government officials are basically admitting to it without admitting to it. And so to get to UFO confirmation or ironclad UFO disclosure, we are going to need some better evidence. the worst case scenario, get a committee of scientists together, give them clearances, let them look at the data and then report back to the public. Maybe that would be enough. But on the other hand, Lou Elizondo has spoken about that. I don't know if infamous is the right word. It's funny, as a YouTube creator, I often look up words. And I'm like, is that the right word? No, infamous might be bad reputation, not just famous, but who cares? I'm going to be lenient with you with the dictionary. Satan has not stopped me today. But, that infamous video, 26 minutes, 23 minutes. I think Elizondo, he once said it's the length of a Simpsons episode, which I like that because it puts it in context. 23 minutes, high fidelity. He's not sure if it's one UAP or multiple UAP because it's doing such weird stuff. I get the impression that it separates, then it comes back together. But the implication from what Lou Elizondo said is that it was doing so much that if you watched it, your mind would be blown. And Elizondo has also been on the record saying that the 3 videos that were released, the Go Fast, the Gimbal, the FLIR one, those were some of the least compelling videos. And beyond that, David Grush has said that he's seen other videos that make him very, very concerned that he cannot explain. I think he might have said that or intimated that. And he said that in terms of transparency, I don't know why those weren't released. And I also recall that Elizondo said that the 23-minute video should be released, implicating that it would not compromise national security. So the bottom line that I'm trying to drive home is that apparently there are much better videos that have been released that would not compromise national security. And if they wouldn't cause disclosure, at least they would get us much closer to disclosure. And I do think the national security apparatus is kind of hiding behind they're utilizing their persistent cop-out that, well, it would compromise national security. I don't believe that. I think they have plenty of videos they can release that wouldn't compromise national security. It's just that, basically what I said before is you can't be a little pregnant when you can't have a little disclosure. There's a reason they're not releasing stuff that would shift the conversation. Furthermore, there have been a lot of talk about even the videos that they've released that Elizondo said are some of the least compelling. There's a lot of compelling information leading to the analysis that those are not even the full videos. And if we saw the full videos of those, they'd be much more compelling. So I think ultimately the U.S. government is going to have to start releasing better data, and with that also giving us more accurate and transparent admissions and stopping the song and dance they've been doing for 70 plus years. When we start getting into that territory, then we'll start doing the waltz with UFO confirmation, UFO disclosure.
Yeah. And speaking of disclosure and a post-disclosure world, what would be your hope would be the best possible outcome in the event of a disclosure?
Bryce Zabel went into this recently, I think on his podcast as well as on Twitter. And this is an assessment that many people have made. James Fox has made this. Other people have made this assessment. Stephen Bassett has made this assessment. It is very plausible that if we get disclosure, it would have an exceedingly positive impact on human psychology. The most obvious potential that could take place is that we would start to perceive our fellow human being more like we are, and the differentials that we make in our minds, we would become more lenient with that, so that, for example, Chinese and Russian people, they would just be human beings. Tribes in the Amazon would just be human beings. People of this ethnicity or this race or this religion, they would just be human beings. So it would have a positive impact on our psychology, and maybe we'd be a little bit more lenient in terms of how we perceive people that have different political views than us. As Bryce Zabel has cited, or this was his perspective, is that we've become an exceedingly divided nation in America, but also an exceedingly divided world. Maybe we would be a little bit more compassionate, a little bit less judgmental, which isn't to suggest that we can't disagree with people and we can't fight for our values and try to get people we want elected and the policies we want instituted and so forth. But maybe we could have a little bit less hatred in our heart, be a little bit less hostile. Maybe we could reflect a little bit more about the reality, as far as I'm concerned, that there isn't a black and white free will. I'm going to say this. This is probably a little bit controversial. People may dislike me for this, but I'm going to say it anyways. I think my perception, my subjective perception, is that by and large, our politics are mostly predicated on our mental wiring, our genetics. Whether we're Democrat or Republican is much more predicated on the nurture we've had throughout our adolescence, college, life experience, and that coupled with our genetics, far more than, we're twiddling our thumb going back and forth. What party do I choose? No, it's organic, right? It's organic. There's not a whole bunch of analysis that goes into it. It could be argued, which is not to say there's not a whole lot of analysis on particular topics, but like kind of where our momentum goes in terms of Democrat, Republican, liberal, or conservative and so forth. I think a lot of that is predicated on the influences we've had growing up in our brain wiring. And I think as a species, as a society, we should probably give more weight to that, because even if we believe that the other side is wrong and that they're hurting the public and that they're hurting people, we would lessen the permeating toxicity surrounding this whole discussion if we spent more time reflecting on how organic our perceptions are often, and how much they are derived from things beyond our control, our genetics, our influences. Just to give a personal example, and also there's the thing about how things are subjective too. Like, I'm the kind of person that even if I hold a position politically, I'm thank God, I'm very good at seeing the other side of the argument, their viewpoint, and I'm able to see how there's value in their perspective, even if I don't agree with it. There could be intellectual value in their perspective. At the end of the day, many political positions are subjective. They just are. I don't know how we would debate that. At least they're subjective to us. Maybe when we pass on to the other side and we have complete context and understanding, they'll be less subjective. But we are, at the end of the day, we're talking monkeys. Things are very subjective. We deal with we're dealing with a biological brain that potentially dampens down our ability to perceive reality. From a personal experience, I used to be more conservative and now I'm more liberal, right? But what I can tell people from my personal experience, when I was more conservative in my perspectives, I don't ever detect there being something in me that said, I want to be a bad person. I want to have bad intentions. It was just organically how I perceived the world. And now, as I'm somewhat less conservative, it's organically how I perceive the world. There's not this like free will, flawless, clean slate that's calculating everything. And I think a lot of the times when we get angry at people for seeing things differently than us, whether consciously or subconsciously, we assume that such calculations are taking place. I don't think they are. And I'll go further. A lot of the things we judge other people for, if we were in their shoes, we had their genetics, we had their upbringing, we had their experiences, it's very likely, in my opinion, we would have the same perceptions that they have. And yet here we are on the other side, looking at them in such a denigrating way, when the ultimate truth is that if we were them, we would see the exact same thing. So in a sense, it's almost like when we are toxic to other people, in some sense and in some circumstances, it could be argued we're just being toxic to ourselves because we're not acknowledging the complexity of the situation. And maybe part of why we're not acknowledging it is because we're just not thinking about it. It's easier not to think about these things. But maybe part of the reasons we're not acknowledging the complexity is because we want to be angry and we want to judge people and we want to feel superior to them. And it's much harder to do that when you acknowledge the complexity of things. And to close, I'm not saying that I'm more righteous or more accurate now that I'm a little bit more liberal. I'm not saying that because I don't know that. I'm not God. I'm just saying that was not the point I was trying to suggest. I'm just saying that I can see it in myself that when I've changed my viewpoints over political topics over time, it's not like I'm a better person now than I was, or vice versa, that I was a better person then and now I'm a worse person, because some people could perceive it that way too. It's that there's just not as much, in my opinion, there's not as much free will that is going into our analysis of certain things that a lot of people assume. And I think our defective perception of how people make choices and see things is part of why there's so much hatred in the world and so much feelings of superiority. Because I think hatred and feelings of superiority go hand in hand. Why can't we move a little bit? Let's maybe distance ourselves from that very binary perception and see things in a more nuanced way. It may just make us it may make us a little bit less hostile. There was something else I wanted to add, but I can't remember. So we'll just leave it at that. But okay, so I think maybe hopefully disclosure. What could be more nuanced and earth-shattering than disclosure based upon everything we discussed? I'm not sure anything could be. So maybe somehow that this revelation will infiltrate how we perceive everything else and make us a little bit less binary. Because I think generally human beings, we are just too binary in how we perceive things. And I think that's problematic. Oh, I'm so glad I remembered, because I would be kicking myself. I wrote a whole article about free will recently. You read it. You can put it in the show notes if you want. But I do think that physical violence, in my subjective opinion, is more under our control than what religion we choose, what our politics are. So I'm not trying to create this perception that there is no free will, and maybe there's not free will, right? I don't know. I know that what's his name? He's a scientist. Sam Harris wrote a whole book about how there's no free will. I don't resonate with that. I think there is free will. I just don't think it manifests how we often assume. And from my subjective model, something like physical violence is more in our control than I'm choosing this religion instead of that religion. I'm choosing this politics instead of that politics. I think that's much more organic. I think that's much more susceptible to our upbringing, to the influences we've had over time, to our inherent mental wiring that we have absolutely no control over. So I'm not trying to create an argument where, well, let's just not judge anybody. No, I'm not. And I'm not even trying to make the argument that we should not judge people for having bad takes. But what I'm saying is, when we do judge people for having what we perceive very often, if not always, as subjectively a bad take, let's include in that mental environment. Let's remind ourselves why we judge other people, that they don't necessarily have some kind of free will to reach that conclusion or that analysis, and that may be coming largely from things that are beyond their control, such as their upbringing, the culture that they were born into, who their friends happen to be based upon who they were around. Maybe they didn't have a father in the home. Maybe they didn't have a mother in the home. Maybe they were born in a highly religious environment, or maybe their mental wiring has a certain structure that made them more susceptible to certain beliefs or perspectives than other people. I guess at the end of the day is, the more complex we perceive reality and the more nuanced it is, maybe the less toxic and hostile we be. Because I think too often when we find a lot of that overriding judgment and hostility and hatred in our hearts, it's because we're seeing things in too simplistic a way. And also we gotta look in the mirror, because sometimes maybe it's because it's our ego, right? We want to feel better than other people. We want to feel like we're above the fray. And I'm just going to include this in, there are people who have personality disorders like narcissism, or like antisocial personality disorders. From the literature that I've seen, and I'm by no means any expert, I've just kind of glossed over it. But from the literature I've seen, these are disorders that you do not choose. They, I think, might be a culmination of wiring and environment, but you would still need the environment and you would still need the wiring for them to happen. And once they happen and your brain fuses that way, there is no cure for it, and you are going to be at a disadvantage versus other people. Now, I'm not saying we're all walking around with diagnosed narcissism or antisocial personality disorder. I'm not making that, obviously. But I think there are shades of truth of that in our brains. We are all walking around with blind spots and susceptibilities and inclinations that are unique to us, that we may not have a whole lot of control over, or any control over. And this speech, if you will, is not to suggest that we should not work on ourselves, that we should not try to be better people and try to diminish our weaknesses and strengthen our strengths and change our behaviors to be better human beings. Because I mean, I do assess that the near-death experience literature has something valuable to teach us. And in the near-death experience literature, one of the very prominent and consistent testimonies people have that claim they've passed on to the other side is that there is a life review. And more than God judging people when they have the life review, it's people judging themselves. So maybe what happens is when we lose our body and we're no longer susceptible to all that brain wiring that influences the way we see things and all of that influence, and we kind of have more of a clean slate, and then we see the full expanse of our life from when we were born to when we die, we are given a level of objectivity that we never could have had in this life. So maybe like when we do something wrong, we will judge ourselves of it, but we'll also have the benefit of understanding the complexity of it, what led to it, why it might have been conducive for us to do X, Y, or Z. And I'm not saying that we won't feel guilty, we won't feel ashamed during this life review. I do think that's part of the equation, but it will be a much more objective analysis. So I included that into what I'm saying simply because I'm not trying to push the rhetoric forward that let's never judge anyone, let's never judge ourselves. No one's ever right, no one's ever wrong. No. People can be obnoxious intentionally. People can be selfish intentionally. I believe I've been obnoxious intentionally. I've been selfish intentionally just by virtue of being an imperfect human being. When I say that, I mean, I believe that I've been obnoxious and selfish in a way that I had the capacity to prevent. I believe that's likely the case. So I'm not giving a thesis that there's no free will. I'm just saying it's a lot more complex. And I feel like maybe UFO disclosure will help us to contemplate these complexities and nuances so that we are less susceptible to feeling all high and mighty and better than other people, and more susceptible to giving to having a little bit less hostility in our hearts and our minds, even when we judge people. And I think we should judge people. I think we should hold people accountable. And obviously, like I said earlier, I think physical violence is more in our control than other things. And even certain opinions and certain words that we say are more in control. Some things are more in control than other things. But I just think that if we go about this whole panorama, if you will, with a little bit more complexity and more nuance and a little bit more grace, we'll all be better off. And we can do that while still judging other people and still trying to make the world the way we see it. But we can do that with diminishing our susceptibility to feeling superior to others. And we can do this all while diminishing the hostility we may feel toward others. And if that can manifest in a post-disclosure world, I think that would probably be a positive thing for all 8 billion of us.
Yeah, well, I think for anybody that is interested in the free will aspect, I think the idea of dependent origination is a really interesting thing to look up, and that's kind of like a Buddhist philosophy. In very simple terms, there's a cause and effect for everything, which ultimately leads to something. And so there's a great portion of free will that is not in our control, even though it would seem that way. But in reality, there's an origin for every inclination, thought, and whatever, and it manifests in such a complex way that to trace it back to the original source is the trick. And if you can do that, you can uproot that, so to speak, and alleviate that condition, right? But that's a whole nother thing. But I think what you're talking about, I think that people's conditioning, their thoughts, their inclinations, often people identify with those as themselves, right? Without thinking about it. It's so subtle that it's like woven into us. But something like a near-death experience, or maybe potentially something like disclosure, will give us that pause that can give us a little bit of distance to have self-reflection. And I think that the disclosures that on a collective level, it's going to give us pause and a moment to reflect, right? Like, because now we know we're being watched, like without a doubt, by other intelligences, right? Like that doesn't even cross our mind. Like, okay, God, right? We're in 2020, in the 21st century. Some people might think of that as like, whatever. I don't want to get into people's idea about God and whatever. But if we knew for a fact that we're being observed, that perspective of like, oh my God, like, somebody's watching you, you act differently kind of thing, right? Like might give us a moment of reflection, like, oh my God, what are we doing? You know what I mean? Like, so there's a lot of potential, I think, for that. And again, for a number of reasons, not even just the idea of, oh, we're being watched, but like, wow, we are a lot more similar as humans than we have thought in all these years, because now we know that there's another intelligence that may look or act or have different beliefs, and scientifically their their senses and their nervous system will cause them to evolve in different ways and have different perceptions. But just that idea is like, it could be so subtle, but if you really contemplate on it, that, yeah, wow, we actually are a lot alike than say this other non-human intelligence or whatever it is. That could be something on a collective level that brings us together. Hopefully not through like, okay, like in a divisive way where it's us and them now and there's a kind of conflict. I really hope that there's not something like that. I think human nature, inevitably there's going to be a group of people that do feel that way at the beginning, right? Just natural instinct. But hopefully we can overcome that type of thinking and again have more nuance and less black and white and not like knee-jerk reactions, because it's going to be necessary, I think, for us to really move forward and make disclosure and everything else that goes with it more meaningful, right? And how can we use disclosure? How can we use the cover up and enduring it and witnessing it as a learning experience? Like, this is where we fucked up. We can look back and say, we made this mistake, we made this mistake, we made this mistake, and next time we're going to do better, kind of thing, right? So I think there's a lot of potential for that. I think there's a lot of potential for disclosure, for growth in disclosure, for us to grow individually and collectively, and maybe even in creativity and all these other different ways that we could potentially grow through experiencing and going through disclosure. And I think that effect will last for generations. I hope, it's not just going to be like, boom, right? We're in a different world the next day. Even though there could be some initial inertia, I think, the conditioning process of us knowing about other intelligences, and we're in a vast universe with life probably throughout the universe, and we're not alone. If they made it, we can make it. All these different kind of ideas and concepts that we will continually have some kind of exponential growth effect. I mean, the potential's there. But with that, we've been going for a while here. Do you have any final parting words for the audience here?
My finally parting words is that it's funny. We've gone so deep. I don't have any parting words, but let me think if I can think of something. I'll just add one little thing to what you laid out, some really great things that I appreciate the things you said. That was insightful. Disclosure will inevitably humble us. Our greatest institutions, whether that's our journalistic community or scientific community, our engineers, our academics, our educators, they have gone their entire lives, and not only them, those before them, they've gone their entire lives, most of them potentially, poo-pooing this topic, thinking it's complete malarkey. And now collectively, we are going to have to come to the realization that we have been deceived by two things. We have been deceived by a much higher intelligence or intelligences, They're the architects of the secrecy, but equally, we have been deceived by world governments utilizing propaganda, and we fell hook, line, and sinker for that. And so I think through the humility that will inevitably be stoked as a result of disclosure, maybe we'll ask ourselves questions like, maybe we're not orchestrating civilization the way we should. The things we assumed were true. So like we assumed that this was all BS, but maybe that factors into other assumptions we've made, and we need to make a lot of changes. So like you said, it would give us this pause that would be conducive to making changes in various aspects of our world, and not only institutionally and governmentally, but also internally and psychologically and spiritually. So, you know, if we harken back to my alien AI hypothesis, and this is being exceedingly optimistic, and in some sense, this is making it a little bit black and white myself, because it may not be this simple. It may be a bunch of factions that have different interests, and this is just what happened to take place. I recognize that.
Yeah.
But if my alien AI hypothesis is true or has some truth to it, then maybe this shift that we will inevitably have, and this humbling and this pause, was intentional. Like maybe everything that's gone on in the past 90 years was a result of their very meticulously orchestrated behaviors and actions, including crashes, landings, including letting us shoot them out of their craft out of the sky, including making agreements with us. Maybe that was all done meticulously to finally lead to the most ultimate reckoning, humbling, and pause we could possibly have. And that disclosure is going to somehow put us on a trajectory where the human species and all of the other species, plant and animal, can persist without us destroying ourselves. So maybe, you know, in the most insanely optimistic light, maybe there's some truth to that. And that's what I'll, and also I'll say I'm Post-Disclosure World on YouTube. If you haven't subscribed, do yourself a favor and subscribe. And that's all I got to say.
Definitely. I'm going to assume most of the people that are here subscribed or watching this are already subscribed to you, but definitely also check out Ryan on Twitter. Is your Twitter Post-Disclosure?
Post-Disclosure.
Okay.
Just Post-Disclosure. So my Twitter is Post-Disclosure and my YouTube is Post-Disclosure World.
Yeah. So thanks so much, Ryan. And I know we're going to be talking more soon. So I'll see you soon.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Thank you for having me on.
Take care, man.
Great. Thank you.